Hello, welcome. This is part one of two for the reading of Catch the Moon by Judith Ortiz Cofer. Louis Cintrone sits on top of a 6-foot pile of hubcaps and watches his father walk away into the steel jungle of his car junkyard. Released into his old man's custody after 6 months in juvenile hall for breaking and entering, and he didn't even take anything. He did it on a dare. But the old lady with the million cats was a light sleeper and good with her aluminum cane. He has a scar on his head to prove it. Now Louis is wondering whether he should have stayed in and done his full time. George Cintrone of George Cintrone and Son Auto Parts and Salvage has decided that Louis should wash and polish every hubcap in the yard. The hill he is sitting on is only the latest couple of hundred wheel covers that have come in. Louis grunts and stands up on top of his silver mountain. He yells at no one, "Someday, son, all this will be yours," and sweeps his arms like the Pope blessing a crowd over the piles of car sandwiches and mounds of metal parts that cover this acre of land outside the city. He is the son of George Cintrone and Son, and so far his father has had more than one reason to wish it was just plain George Cintrone on the side. Louis has been getting in trouble since he started high school 2 years ago, mainly because of the social group he organized. A bunch of guys who were into harassing the local authorities. Their thing was taking something to the limit on a dare, or, better still, doing something dangerous, like breaking into a house. Not to steal, just to prove that they could do it. That was Louis's specialty, coming up with very complicated plans like military strategies and assigning the jobs to guys who wanted to join the Tiburones. Tiburone means shark, and Louis had gotten the name from watching an old movie about a Puerto Rican gang called the Sharks with his father. Louis thought it was one of the dumbest films he had ever seen. Everybody sang their lines, and the guys all pointed their toes and leapt in the air when they were supposed to be slaughtering each other. But he liked their name, the Sharks, so he made it Spanish and had it air painted on his black t-shirt with a killer shark under it, jaws open wide and dripping with blood. It didn't take long for the other guys in the barrio to ask about it. Man, had they had a good time. The girls were interested too. Louis outsmarted everybody by calling his organization a social club and registering it at Central High. That meant they were legal, even let out of last period class on Fridays for their club meetings. It was just this year, after a couple of botched jobs, the teachers had started to get suspicious. The first one to go wrong was when he sent Kenny Mateo to borrow some souvenirs out of Anita Robles' locker. He got caught. It seems that Mateo had been reading Anita's diary and didn't hear her coming down the hall. Anita was supposed to be in the gym at the time, but had copped out with the usual female excuse of cramps. You could hear her screams all the way to Market Street. She told the principal all she knew about the Tiburones, and Louis had to talk fast to convince old Mr. Williams that the club did put on cultural activities, such as the Save the Animals talent show. What Mr. Williams didn't know was that the animal that was being saved with the ticket sales was Louis's pet boa, which needed quite a few live mice to stay healthy and happy. They kept ES, which stood for Endangered Species, in Louis's room, but she belonged to the club, and it was the members' responsibility to raise the money to feed their mascot. So last year, they had sponsored the first annual Save the Animals talent show, and it had been a great success. The Tiburones had come dressed as Latino Elvises and did a grand finale to All Shook Up that made the audience go wild. Mr. Williams had smiled while Louis talked, maybe remembering how the math teacher, Mrs. Laguna, had dragged him out into the aisle to rock and roll with her. Louis had gotten out of that one, but barely. His father had a problem too. He objected to the t-shirt logo, calling it disgusting and vulgar. Mr. Cintrone prided himself on his own neat, elegant style of dressing after work, and on his manners and large vocabulary, which he picked up by taking correspondence courses in just about everything. Louis thought it was just his way of staying busy, since Louis's mother had died almost 3 years ago of cancer. He had never gotten over it. All this was going through Louis's head as he slid down the hill of hubcaps. The tub full of soapy water, the can of polish, and the bag of rags had been neatly placed in front of a makeshift table made of 2 car seats and a piece of plywood. Lewis heard a car drive up and someone honked their horn. His father emerged from inside a new red Mustang that had been totaled. He usually dismantled every small feature by hand before sending the vehicle into the cementerio, as he called the lot. Lewis watched as the most beautiful girl he had ever seen climbed out of a vintage white Volkswagen Bug. She stood in the sunlight in her white sundress, waiting for his father, while Lewis stared. She was like a smooth wood carving. Her skin was mahogany, almost black, and her arms and legs were long and thin, but curved in places so she did not look bony and hard, more like a ballerina. And her ebony hair was braided close to her head. Lewis let his breath out, feeling a little dizzy. He had forgotten to breathe. Both the girl and his father heard him. Mr. Centrone waved him over. Lewis, the senorita here, has lost a wheel cover. Her car is 25 years old, so it will not be an easy match. Come look on this side. Lewis tossed a wrench he'd been holding into a toolbox like he was annoyed, just to make a point about slave labor. Then he followed his father, who knelt on the gravel and began to point out every detail of the hubcap. Lewis was hardly listening. He watched the girl take a piece of paper from her handbag. Senor Centrone, I have drawn the hubcap for you, since I will have to leave soon. My home address and telephone number are here, and also my parents' office number. She handed the paper to Mr. Centrone, who nodded. Si, senorita. Very good. This will help my son look for it. Perhaps there is one in that stack there. He pointed to the pile of caps that Lewis was supposed to wash and polish. Yes, I'm almost certain that there is a match there. Of course, I do not know if it's near the top or the bottom. You will give us a few days, yes? Lewis just stared at his father like he was crazy. But he didn't say anything because the girl was smiling at him with a funny expression on her face. Maybe she thought he had X-ray eyes like Superman, or maybe she was mocking him. Please call me Naomi, Senor Centrone. You know my mother. She is the director of the funeral home. Mr. Centrone seemed surprised at first. He prided himself on having a great memory. Then his friendly expression changed to one of sadness as he recalled the day of his wife's burial. Naomi did not finish her sentence. She reached over and placed her hand on Mr. Centrone's arm for a moment. Then she said, adios, softly, and got in her shiny white car. She waved to them as she left, and her gold bracelets flashing in the sun nearly blinded Lewis. Mr. Centrone shook his head. How about that? He said as if to himself. They are the Dominican owners of Ramirez Funeral Home. And with a sigh, she seems like such a nice young woman. Reminds me of your mother when she was her age. All right, so we're going to pause there, and we'll finish the story in this second video. So we have our conflict, we have our characters, and we have Lewis, who seems like a character in desperate need of some changes. We see a lot of suffering, and we see a lot of weight that he's carrying with him, with his mother having passed and his father struggling with that, and just the struggling relationship he has with his father. And so we will see how these conflicts and issues may conclude in the second half of Catch the Moon.